The scar of the valley was a memory etched in granite and bleached bone. Silas lived on its edge, a penance he paid to the ghosts of the cottonwoods below. 10 years he'd been there, in a cabin built from the timber of trees that had witnessed the slaughter. He breathed the air of the dead and drank from a creek that had once run red. He was a man flaying himself with the landscape, seeking an absolution the silent, watching peaks would never grant. This land did not forgive, it remembered. The wind, combing through the high plains grass, whispered names he tried to forget. The cry of a hawk was an accusation. Every sunrise painted the eastern ridges in a wash of blood orange, a daily reminder of the dawn he'd ridden with Custer's men, a scout leading them into a place that should have remained hidden, a sanctuary. He had desecrated with his knowledge of the earth. He hadn't fired a shot in the massacre that followed, a point of pride so small and rotten it felt like another sin. He had only watched, his refusal a silent scream swallowed by the thunder of carbines and the shrieks of the dying. Then he had deserted, vanishing into the very wilderness he'd betrayed, becoming a ghost himself. It was in the heart of a blue winter, when the world was frozen into a brittle, unforgiving silence, that he found her. He was checking his traps along the half-frozen creek, the one the Arapaho called Ne'eni-Ahi, the lifeblood river. The air was so cold it felt solid, a pane of glass that might shatter with a sudden sound. And then he saw it, a stain of crimson against the stark white snow, a single impossible flower of violence blooming in the frost. He followed the trail of drops, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. It led to a small hollow carved out by the roots of an ancient spruce, a place sheltered from the wind. There, curled into a shape of impossible smallness, was a child, a native girl, no older than 7 or 8. She was wrapped in a tattered buffalo hide, her small body trembling with a life that was rapidly fading. A deep gash, ugly and crusted, with frozen blood, ran along her side. It was a wound from a blade, not an animal. Silas froze. The world tilted, the silence pressing in. To help her was to invite the reckoning he had spent a decade hiding from. The nearest settlement was a week's ride, and they would see only her skin, not her wound. They would call it a problem to be solved with a rope or a bullet. To leave her was to commit the one sin he had, until now, managed to avoid, to turn his back on a dying child. It was the choice he'd been given 10 years ago, on a grander scale, and his failure then echoed now in the hollow of the spruce roots. He knelt, the snow crunching under his knees like broken bone. Her breath was a faint, shallow mist. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her black hair matted with ice. She was Arapaho. He knew the intricate beadwork on the frayed edge of her moccasin, the pattern of a tribe he had known in another life, a life before shame. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers clumsy with cold and fear. He expected her to flinch, too. Cry out, she did not. Her eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, dark, and deep, like fissures in obsidian, holding a knowledge that dwarfed his own sorry existence. They looked straight through him, seeing not the hermit in worn buckskin, but the scout, the betrayer, the man who had stood by. His choice was made. It had been made 10 years ago. He gently scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile collection of bones and spirit. As he lifted her, a faint sound escaped her lips, a whisper so soft. It was more felt than heard, carried on the ghost of her breath. It was a name spoken in the old tongue, a name not meant for his ears. It sounded like a prayer or a curse. He carried her back toward his cabin, his boots leaving deep wounds in the snow. Above, a lone hawk circled in the vast indifferent sky, its cry a thin, sharp note that pierced the silence and stitched the moment into the tapestry of his eternal damnation. He had touched one of theirs, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that they would know. The land would tell them, His cabin was less a home than a wound that had scabbed over. It was a single room, the log walls, chinked with mud and moss, smelling of pine smoke, dried herbs and solitude. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a cot with a threadbare wool blanket the other. On a rough-hewn table sat the evidence of his exile: a knife, a whetstone, a tin cup, and a Bible he never opened, its leather cover warped by the damp. It had belonged to his wife Elora, who had died of the fever long before he'd ridden west, her memory another ghost in the crowded room of his heart. He laid the girl on his cot, her small form barely making an impression on the straw mattress. For a moment, she was his own daughter, the one he and Elora had dreamed of, the one who had died with her mother, a tiny, unnamed thing. The thought was a hot poker to his soul. He pushed it away and focused on the task. He stoked the fire until the hearth glowed with a fierce, protective warmth. He melted snow in a kettle and gently, painstakingly, began to clean her wound. She did not cry out, did not even whimper. She watched him, her dark eyes unblinking, reflecting the dancing flames. It was an unnerving stillness, the calm of a creature that has seen the worst the world has to offer and is no longer capable of surprise. As he worked, his hands, calloused and scarred from a decade of trapping and solitude, became surprisingly gentle. He cut away the stiff, blood-soaked fabric of her deerskin dress. Underneath, he saw not just the fresh gash, but older scars. Thin, white lines latticed her skin, ritualistic and deliberate, scars of mourning. This child had already known profound loss. She was a vessel of grief. He found the source of her wound. Tucked into the folds of her dress was a U.S. cavalry coat button, its brass eagle tarnished. The gash was next to it, as if she had been stabbed while clutching this relic, or while it was being torn from her. He stared at it, the eagle seeming to mock him from its perch on his palm. It was from the 7th, Custer's men, his men. He closed his fist around it, the metal cold and heavy, a solid piece of his past. He wanted to hurl it into the fire, but he couldn't. It was part of her story now, not just his. He quietly slipped it into his pocket, a secret shared between them. He stitched the wound with a needle and gut thread, his movements precise and economical. He had learned the skill from a trapper long ago, a man who said a clean stitch could mean the difference between walking away and being buried where you fell. He smeared the closure with a poultice of yarrow and pine sap, an old remedy his mother had used. The smell filled the small cabin, a scent of healing and earth. He covered her with his thickest blanket, tucking it around her small shoulders. And then there was nothing to do but wait. The days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light across the snow-covered valley. The world outside was a silent white expanse. The world inside was a crucible of unspoken histories. They were two ghosts under one roof, their shared space charged with the voltage of what was unsaid. He was no hero. He was a coward who had chosen exile over justice. He had not fought for the Arapaho. He had simply run from the shame of fighting against them. He had watched as Sergeant Maccabee had torn a necklace from a screaming woman's neck, had watched as soldiers had set fire to the lodges with families still inside. His inaction was a brand on his soul. He saw it every time he looked at the girl. And she was a universe of silent suffering. She never spoke a word, not one. When he offered her broth, she would drink it, her eyes fixed on his. But it was in the quiet moments that their wounds truly clashed. She would stare at the fire, her small face illuminated by the flames, but she wasn't watching the dance of the light. She was watching something else within it, her expression so distant and so full of ancient sorrow that it made the hair on his arms stand up. She was remembering fire not as a source of warmth, but as a weapon, a destroyer. She was watching it kill someone she loved. He tried to speak to her, his voice rough from disuse. He told her his name was Silas. He told her about the hawk that nested on the high ridge. He told her about the way the ice on the creek sang when the wind was just right. He spoke of trivial things, hoping to fill the deafening silence. She would only watch him, her gaze a weight he could feel on his skin. It was not the gaze of a child seeking comfort, but of a judge weighing a soul. He was a man who had lost a child he never knew. She was a child who had lost a family he had helped to destroy. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with the ghosts of who they had been, the specters of who they had lost. It was a language of shared trauma, a dialogue of colliding griefs. Louder than any gunshot, more profound than any scream, their silence filled the small cabin until Silas felt he would suffocate on the sheer, crushing weight of it. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the very bones of the cabin, he found himself humming. It was an old tune, a lullaby Elora used to hum while she sewed, a simple, gentle melody from a world that no longer existed. He stopped himself ashamed. It felt like a sacrilege, bringing the ghost of his wife into this already crowded space of sorrow. But the girl, lying on the cot, turned her head. Her eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something other than pain, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. He thought of the soldier's button he had taken from her. The next morning, when the storm had passed and the world was draped in a fresh, blinding sheet of white, he walked to the edge of the woods. He dug a small hole in the frozen earth with the tip of his knife. He dropped the brass button in and covered it, tamping down the snow with his boot. It was a futile gesture, burying a single sin when he was buried in an avalanche of them, but it felt necessary. A burial, an apology to the dirt. When he returned, she was sitting up. In the ash that had spilled from the hearth, she had drawn a picture with her small finger. It was a circle, and inside the circle, a star, a morning star. He looked at it, then at her. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he felt she was not looking through him, but at him. The fragile truce of their shared silence began to shift. It was no longer a clash, but a quiet, reverent space. He would whittle small figures for her, a bird, a wolf, a faceless man. She would accept them without expression, but he would find them later, arranged in careful patterns on the floor. She began to eat more, the broth and dried meat he offered giving her a strength that was more than physical. A light was returning to her, a slow dawn after a long dark night. He would talk to her sometimes, not expecting answers. He told her about Elora, about the fever that took her and their unborn child. He spoke of his shame, the words spilling out of him in a ragged, halting confession to this silent child. He told her of the scout's path he had walked, of the beauty of the land he had come to love, and of the horror of leading the bluecoats to the winter camp on the Washita. He didn't name the place, he didn't have to. The memory was a physical presence in the room. "I didn't fire," he whispered to her one night, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "I swear to God, I never fired. I just watched. And that was worse." She listened, her expression unchanging. But her stillness felt different now. It was not the stillness of trauma, but of deep, ancient listening. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the snow outside in hues of rose and violet, she began to hum. It was not the lullaby he had hummed. It was a low, guttural chant, a song that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a sound that belonged to the wind and the rock and the endless sky. It was a song of her people. He sat perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. The melody was haunting, filled with a sorrow so profound it was almost beautiful. It spoke of generations, of loss, of a resilience that defied comprehension. And he realized with a jolt that chilled him to his core, she was not humming for him. The song was not for the two of them in their tiny, isolated world. She was humming for someone who was listening from outside, someone who had been watching all along. The fragile peace shattered. The dreamlike state they had occupied for weeks evaporated, replaced by a thrumming, palpable sense of dread. The quiet was no longer a shelter. It was the deep breath before. The storm, the air grew thick with imminence. He could feel it in the way the fire crackled, in the way the shadows clung to the corners of the room. They were coming. The arrival did not begin with a war cry or the thunder of hooves. It began with silence. At that sacred liminal hour just before sunrise, when the sky was a bruised purple and the stars were fading, Silas saw him. A single rider, sitting motionless on his horse on the ridge overlooking the cabin. He was a silhouette against the pre-dawn light, a statue carved from the night itself. He wasn't looking at the cabin, but at the smoke curling from its chimney, a thin, gray finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Silas's blood ran cold. He had known this day would come, but the reality of it was a physical blow. He did not reach for his rifle. What good would one gun be against the judgment of an entire people? This was not a fight to be won with lead and powder. This was a debt to be paid. He watched the rider, and as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw another materialize from the fog-shrouded pines. And another, and another. They did not ride down. They simply appeared, lining the horizon in a silent, unbroken chain. There were 20, then 50, then what seemed like 100. Warriors on horseback, their forms stark and powerful, their presence transforming the familiar landscape into a courtroom. The trees, the rocks, the very air seemed to become witnesses. The world went utterly quiet. The wind died. The chattering of a waking squirrel ceased. Even the hiss of the fire in his hearth seemed to have been silenced. All that was left was the pounding of his own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the vast waiting silence of the land. Then, a movement. The line of warriors parted. A man began to walk down the gentle slope toward the cabin. He was on foot, a deliberate act of profound authority. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of granite and grief. His long hair was streaked with gray, and he wore a breastplate of polished bone that seemed to glow in the dim light. He did not walk alone. His hand rested on the shoulder of a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, who walked beside him with a solemn dignity that belied his age. This was the chief. Silas looked at the girl on the cot. Her eyes were open, and she was calm. Utterly, unnervingly calm. She knew. She had been waiting for them. Her humming had been a summons. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This was it, the end of his exile, the beginning of his reckoning. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside into the frigid air. He did not look at the army on the ridge. He looked only at the chief, who was now standing 20 feet away, his eyes holding the accumulated sorrow of a generation. The chief's gaze was like a physical weight. It pinned Silas to the spot, stripped him bare, and saw every last rotten corner of his soul. He saw the scout, the deserter, the coward. The chief's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the immense power of the mountains behind him. It was a low rumble, the sound of stone grinding against stone. "Ho-hoo," he said. The Arapaho word for hello, but it was not a greeting. It was an opening statement, a calling to order. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Silas's. "You have a child of the Hinonoeno," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, which was more terrifying than any rage. "The people, you touched one of ours." The accusation hung in the air, crystalline and sharp. It was not a question. It was a verdict. In that moment, 10 years of solitude, of self-flagellation, of running, came to an end. There was no defense to offer, no explanation that could suffice. There was only the truth, bare and ugly. Silas did something he had not done since he was a boy in his mother's church. He dropped to one knee in the snow. He bowed his head, exposing the back of his neck. It was not an act of fear, though fear was a roaring inferno inside him. It was an act of surrender, an act of atonement. He was finally, after a decade of hiding, ready to receive his judgment. The warriors did not take him with violence. There was no need. His surrender was total. Two men, their faces painted with stark lines of black and white, stepped forward. They did not bind his hands with rope, but with their presence. One stood on his left, one on his right, and their nearness was more absolute than any shackle. They motioned with their heads for him to walk, and he obeyed, rising from the snow and following the chief, Nuku, back up the slope toward the silent assembly. As he walked, he felt hundreds of eyes on him. They were not filled with hatred, but with a heavy, ancient judgment. It was the collective gaze of a people who had endured a century of lies, treaties broken like twigs, and violence that stole their children from their arms. He was the embodiment of it all, the pale-skinned specter who had brought the wolf to their door. They led him not to a camp, but to a clearing just over the ridge, a place holy and hidden. A great fire had already been built in its center, its flames licking at the dawn sky. The warriors formed a vast silent circle around it. This was their council, their church, their court. They brought the girl from the cabin. She was no longer wearing the tattered deerskin dress. She was wrapped in a magnificent buffalo robe, decorated with quillwork that told the story of her lineage. The boy who had walked with the chief now stood by her side, his hand holding hers. Her face was clean, her hair braided with otter fur. She was no longer a lost, wounded child. She was transformed. She was royalty. The chief Nuku stood before Silas. The firelight danced across the planes of his face, making his expression seem to flicker between sorrow and stone. 10 winters ago, Nuku began, his voice echoing in the unnerving stillness. A blue-coat army was led to our winter camp on the river bend. They came at sunrise. They were led by a scout who knew the secret ways of the land, a man who had shared coffee with our hunters and traded tobacco with our elders. Silas's heart seized. He could not breathe. That scout, Nuku continued, his eyes boring into Silas, watched as the soldiers burned our lodges. He watched as they killed our women. He watched as they murdered the chief, a man named White Eagle. Nuku paused, letting the weight of the name settle over the assembly. A low, mournful sound rippled through the circle of warriors, a collective sigh of grief. "I am Nuku, brother of White Eagle," the chief said, his voice cracking with a decade of unshed tears. "And now you will tell me, were you that scout?" The world spun. The trees, the fire, the faces, they all blurred into a vortex of accusation. There was no escape. The lie he had lived for 10 years was a flimsy shelter against this hurricane of truth. He could deny it. He could try to save his own skin. But looking at the grave, dignified faces around him, he knew that a lie would be the final, unforgivable desecration. "Yes," Silas said, the word a ragged piece of broken glass torn from his throat. "I was that man." A tremor went through the crowd. Not of shock, but of confirmation. He didn't stop. The confession, once begun, poured out of him like poison from a lanced wound. "I led them. I showed them the way," he gasped, the words tumbling over one another. "I saw it all. I saw White Eagle fall. I saw a woman. She was running for the creek with a babe in her arms. A soldier, Sergeant Maccabee. He shot her in the back. I see her face every night, every time I close my eyes." He finally looked up, his own eyes streaming with tears he hadn't known. He was capable of shedding. He looked at Nuku, expecting the killing blow. "I did not fire my rifle," he whispered, the pathetic defense sounding hollow even to his own ears. "But I am as guilty as any of them. I ran. I hid. My life since that day has been a lie. So I ask you, end it." He fell to his knees again, offering his life not as a bargain, but as the only payment he had left to give. He begged for punishment. He begged for the justice he had denied them for so long. Silence descended once more, thick and absolute. Nuku stood over him, a towering figure of righteous fury and profound grief. Silas closed his eyes, waiting for the knife, the club, the bullet. Instead, he heard the chief's voice, softer now, laced with a pain that was fathomless. "The woman you saw," Nuku said slowly, "was my brother's wife, Singing Reed. The babe in her arms died with her, but she had another child. A daughter, hidden in the roots of a willow tree before she ran. A child she saved with her last breath." Silas's eyes shot open. He looked from Nuku to the girl standing by the fire. The girl in the magnificent robe. The child with the ancient eyes. "My niece," Nuku said, his voice thick with emotion, "has been without a name. We do not name a child who has not yet found their path. For 10 years, she has been in the care of the spirits, wandering between worlds. Sickness took her 2 moons ago, a fever of the soul. The elders said her spirit was lost in the snow, looking for her mother. They said she would not return to us unless a great debt was paid." He gestured to the girl. She took a step forward, her small moccasins making no sound on the frozen ground. "When she vanished from our camp," Nuku continued, "we tracked her. We found her trail leading into the Valley of Ghosts, the place where our people were slain. We saw your tracks meet hers. We watched your cabin for many weeks. We saw the smoke from your fire. We saw you care for her. We waited," the elders said. The spirits were at work. Nuku knelt, not before Silas, but before the girl, his niece. "Child," he said in their tongue, "tell us what the spirits showed you in your fever dream." The girl, who had not spoken a single word in Silas's presence, now spoke. Her voice was clear and high, like the sound of bells in the winter air. She spoke in the flowing musical cadence of the Arapaho language, though Silas could not understand. The words, he understood their power. All eyes were on her. She was not just a child, she was an oracle. The boy beside her, Nuku's son, stepped forward to translate, his voice solemn. "She says that in her dream, she saw her mother by the frozen river. Her mother told her not to be afraid. She said a man would come, a man with eyes the color of cold ash. She said this man carried a great shadow, the ghost of the man who killed her. But he also carried a great light, the light of a promise he failed to keep." The boy looked directly at Silas, his young face a mask of awe and confusion. "She saw a vision. A blue-coat soldier, the ghost of the one you called Maccabee, rising from the snow to pull her into the ice. But the man with the ash-colored eyes stood between them. He became a shield. He did not fight the ghost with a weapon, but with his sorrow. He bled his own guilt onto the snow, and the ghost dissolved. The world held its breath." Silas stared, his mind reeling. The mercy he was being shown was not forgiveness. It was something far more complex, more profound. It was destiny. Atonement, it seemed, was not about dying. It was about living with the consequences, about fulfilling a role he had been chosen. For by forces he could not comprehend. The girl walked toward him. She stopped directly in front of his kneeling form. He was a broken man, a confessed sinner, expecting death. He bowed his head, unable to look at her, the living embodiment of his failure. Then he felt it. A small, warm hand on the crown of his head. It was her hand. It did not condemn. It did not forgive. It simply rested there, a bridge of flesh and blood across an ocean of pain and history. It was an act of acceptance, an acknowledgement of his place in her vision. In that single silent touch, a decade of guilt was not erased, but transformed. It became a burden he would now carry for her, not just against her. The fire roared, casting their long shadows across the snow, binding them together in a tableau of reckoning and irrational grace. The ceremony that followed was beyond Silas's understanding, a ritual woven from threads of myth, memory, and sacred law. He had thought the fire was for his execution. He was wrong. The fire was for a beginning. The drums started, a low, steady heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the core of the earth. It was the rhythm of seasons, of migrations, of life and death. The warriors began to chant, their voices rising and falling in a powerful chorus that spoke to the mountains and the sky. Nuku led his niece to the edge of the fire. She stood bathed in its golden light, her small form radiating an impossible power. She was no longer Nuku's niece or White Eagle's daughter. She was a vessel of her people's history, their pain, and their endurance. An elder, a man so old his face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, stepped forward holding a feathered staff. He spoke to the girl, his voice a dry rustle of autumn leaves. He was giving her a name earned through her journey, her vision, her survival. Nuku's son translated for Silas, his voice a reverent whisper against the backdrop of the drums. He is naming her. He calls her Nina Zatoyu. He paused, searching for the English words. It means, she who carries the dawn star, because she found the light in the deepest darkness. Nina Zatoyu. The morning star, the drawing in the ash. It was her name. It was her soul. Silas watched, feeling like a ghost witnessing a holy rite. He believed. His part was over. He was a witness, a confessed sinner whose life had been spared. But then, the old elder turned his gaze on him. Nuku walked back to where Silas knelt, his shadow falling over him. Your judgment is not death, Silas, the chief said, his voice heavy. Death is an escape. Your judgment is to live. Your judgment is to fulfill the vision. The elder approached, his dark eyes seeming to pierce the veil between worlds. He began to speak again, his words directed at Silas. The chant of the warriors shifted, the drums changing their rhythm. Nuku's son translated again, his voice filled with awe. He says that you are the man who stood in the middle. You stood between the living and the dead. You stood between our world and the world of the whites. You carry the shadow of their violence, but you also carry the seed of their atonement. The elder dipped his fingers into a small bowl containing a mixture of ash from the fire and melted snow. He stepped forward and drew a line across Silas's forehead, from temple to temple. The mark was cold, then strangely warm. It felt like a brand, a permanent alteration of his being. They are giving you a name, the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Who Castillo? Silas looked at Nuku, a question in his eyes. Nuku answered it. It means the bridge, or the man who listens. It is not a name of honor. It is a name of service, a name of burden. You will no longer be Silas, the hermit. You will be Hu Castillo, the man who stands at the edge of our lands, a guardian against the world you came from. You will listen for danger. You will be our sentinel. This is your life now. This is your penance. It is a debt that can only be paid with the rest of your days. Silas looked at Nina Zatoyu. She was watching him, her expression serene. She had seen this. She had known this. He was not being punished with death. He was being bound to life, to their life. He was being woven into their story, not as a hero, but as a scar that had been given a purpose. A scar that would serve as a reminder, a shield. He looked at the faces in the circle, at the fire, at the vast, eternal sky. He was no longer a man in exile. He was a man with a sacred, irreversible duty. He had asked for punishment, and they had given him a reason to live. He had begged for an ending, and they had given him a beginning. The weight of it was heavier than any stone, more binding than any chain. It was the price of grace. Silas never returned to his cabin. It was left to the wind and the snow, a monument to a man who had died on that ridge. He became Hu Castillo. He did not live among the Arapaho in their village of hide lodges, but in a small, solitary tipi they erected for him on the westernmost edge of their territory. a place that overlooked the vast plains from which the white world encroached. He did not take a wife. He did not father children. His new bloodline was not one of flesh but of purpose. His life's blood was now pledged to the survival of Nenezatoyu and her people. He was a bridge, a liminal being belonging to neither world, his solitude no longer a punishment, but a sacred watch. He learned their language not through formal lessons, but by listening. He learned the language of the wind, the migration of the herds, the subtle shifts in the clouds that foretold the coming of storms or strangers. The Arapaho warriors would ride out to his lonely post, not to speak with him, but to sit in silence, sharing a pipe, their communion deeper than words. They brought him food, furs, and news. They told him of the movements of the bluecoats, of the iron horse that was scarring the plains, of the slow, relentless tide of the new world. He, in turn, listened. He watched. He became the eyes and ears. On their frontier, years passed. His hair turned the color of the winter snow. His face became as weathered and fissured as the canyons he watched over. The children of the tribe grew up knowing the story of the strange white man who lived on the edge of the world, the man with ash-colored eyes who was bound to them by a debt of sorrow and a vision of grace. Nenezatoyu grew into a wise and respected woman, a leader among her people, her name a testament to the light she carried. Sometimes she would ride out to his lonely watch. They would sit for hours, watching the sunset paint the sky, never speaking a word. There was nothing that needed to be said. Their story was written in the silence between them, in the shared landscape of their past. He died as he had lived. For those final decades alone, sitting cross-legged at the door of his tipi, looking out at the land he guarded. He did not die from violence or sickness, but as if his purpose had been fulfilled, his long watch finally over. It was Nuku's son, now a great leader himself, who found him. They did not bury him in the manner of the whites, nor in the sacred way of the Arapaho. They wrapped him in a buffalo robe and placed his body on a high scaffold on the ridge, a place between the earth and the sky. A bridge, even in death. Years later, when storytellers recounted the history of the Hinono Aino, they would speak of the dark time, of the massacre at the river, and of the girl who was lost and found. And they would always end the tale with the man who saved her, the man they had named Hukastiu. On a flat stone near his final resting place, an elder carved a simple inscription, a summary of a life that had been redeemed not through greatness, but through sacrifice. The words became a legend, whispered to the fire for generations to come. He gave what the others never did, time, and blood, and silence.